It's a way to get attention, I guess. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here at this very exciting event. We here at the library just want to emphasize how appreciative we are with the friends of the library who sponsored this event, so many others. It's just such a charm and joy to have people like Jeff Smalldon here. So we do have Paul Sikora as well, former board president for over 30 years, friend of the library, enthusiast of the library, and friend of Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon. I will turn it over to him. Thank you, Mr. Sikora. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you very much. It is my high honor and privilege to introduce my very good friend, Jeff Smalldon. Jeff and I have been friends for over 55 years, which doesn't seem possible, but we're both graduates of the class of 1971, as are a lot of our attendees here today, which is wonderful. Jeff obtained his bachelor's from Valparaiso University in 1975 as an English major with a minor in psychology. He received his master's from Purdue University in 1976 in English, taught as a member of Valparaiso University's English department for the 1977-78 school year, postgraduate diploma in Anglo-Irish literature from Trinity College, the University of Dublin in 1979. I don't have too much more to go. Master's in Health Service Administration from George Washington University in 1982. PhD in Psychology from Ohio State University in 1989. 25 years in private practice as a clinical and forensic psychologist, consulted on close to 300 death penalty cases in both state and federal court, acted as the court's expert in well over 1,000 child custody cases, performed hundreds of competency to stand trial criminal responsibility, aka sanity, and sex offender evaluations, former adjunct assistant professor of psychology at Ohio State for many years, and a long history dating back to the mid-70s of correspondence with some of the most notorious serial and mass killers and a would-be presidential assassin in Squeaky Fromme in modern American history, including Charles Manson, Squeaky Fromme, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. Spent close to 20 hours with John Wayne Gacy in the death row visiting room in Illinois. I received the book on my electronic reader last week, and I've read all 474 pages, and I highly endorse it. It's a very readable account. It's like sitting down with Jeff and having him talk to you. But with no further ado, I'd like to have Jeff take the microphone.
Thank you very much, Paul. I was going to sit because I've got a bad back, but I think I'll stand so I can see you and you can see me a little bit better. Who said you can't go home again? It's wonderful to be back in North Tonawanda. It's been almost 50 years since I lived here on a full-time basis, but I've never stopped calling it my hometown. That's still how I think of it. I want to tell you a really quick little anecdote. For me, sort of speaks volumes about this place. As my sister June could attest, toward the end of my mom's life, she died in 2019, she always liked to shop at Tops over on Meadow. And she would never let June and I just go in and get her groceries. And she was very immobile, but she would insist on going in because she said, we wouldn't be able to understand the geography of the store or the way the inventory was stocked on the shelves. So she insisted on going in. So kind of in tribute to my mom today, I stopped at Tops. And as I was checking out with the few provisions that I had gone there to buy, the woman who was checking me out said, do you have I think a rewards card or something? And I said, no, I don't. I'm not from North Tonawanda. And then I said, well, I kind of am, but I've lived for years in Columbus, Ohio. And she said, oh, well, did you go to NT High School? And I said, yeah. And she said, what year did you graduate? And I said, 1971. And she said, I bet you know my brother. And I said, who's your brother? And she said, Joe Payne. And I said, the Joey Payne? And she said, probably. And then she said, what's your last name? And I said, Smalldon. And she said, are you that book guy? And I thought, where else? Are you that book guy? So somehow word of my presence in town had gotten to her. Anyway, it's really, really nice to be here. Great to see such a big crowd. Have any of you heard about my crime spree? Behind the Mask, the chilling crimes of Jeffrey Smalldon. No one has encountered this? Right at the time my book was published, August 6th, this appeared on Amazon right under my book. And I thought, what? And so, of course, I had to get it. My wife said, why would you order that? You know, that's obviously some sort of scam. And I think it's some sort of AI generated, you know, it's full of kind of boilerplate, non-specific statements about some horrible human being named Jeffrey Smalldon who committed serial murder, went to trial, used a mental state defense, and was sent to prison for years. So there it is. Up for parole, right, I'm out. I thought I would start just quickly by kind of diverting a little bit from the organization of the material in the book to tell you just kind of the outlines of chronology for you to use to understand some of the more content-oriented things I'm going to say in a minute. I grew up the son of, I always describe him as a Hoover-era G-man, old-school FBI agent. And so I was interested all my life in crime, criminology, the law. In the book, I think I say there was always a low hum of talk about crime and Stefano Magaddino and so on in our home. So I was always interested in criminals. But maybe it never would have gone any further than that. But when I was a senior in college, 21 years old, 1975, in kind of a fever, I read the best-selling true crime book of all time, Helter Skelter, about the Manson case, in one caffeine-fueled binge that began at about 3 one afternoon and ended at 11 the next morning. I just couldn't put it down. I was so interested in it. And one of the things that interested me the most about the Manson case was that some of the people who followed this career criminal, who's about 5'4", fourth grade education, came from middle-class backgrounds, not so unlike my own. I couldn't figure it out. Like, why did they do what they did? Why were they looking to him as kind of a godlike figure? And shortly after I read Helter Skelter, my professor for a course I was taking in abnormal psychology mentioned in class that he had also read Helter Skelter. And I thought, well, I'm going to stay after class and talk with him about it, and I did. And one of the things I said to him in the course of that conversation was, you know, you would read newspaper, media accounts of that case and think that these people who acted at Manson's behest, including killing people at his behest, were kind of automatons, like who had lost all ability to function independently and just did what Manson told them to do. And I said, you know, it's weird. Some of those people came from backgrounds not unlike my own. I wonder if it's a little more complicated than you would think it is from media accounts. And he said, well, have you ever thought of writing them? And I said, no. I mean, the thought had never crossed my mind of writing members of the Manson family. And he said, well, it might be interesting to find out what their voices sounded like on paper. So it took a while, but I did that. And that's like a big chunk of what's in this book. I'll get back to the content of that in a minute, but I want to establish the chronology here. That correspondence with Manson, Squeaky Fromme, Susan Atkins, other members of the Manson family, took place across a period of about 3 years. And I probably would have left that behind at that point. It would have been one of my forays, outside the world my parents had in mind for me to investigate some of these outsider, outlaw types that had always fascinated me. And I thought I was going to be an English professor. So I continued to study, graduate study in English. And while I was overseas in Ireland, I decided, I don't really think I would be happy in academia. I need to do something different from that. And this is where the story gets very North Tonawanda heavy. I come back from Ireland. I literally had no idea what to do. And one day I said to my mother, I just have no clue what path I should travel. I've decided I don't want to be an English professor. And she was a nurse down at DeGraff, and she said, well, there are a couple good-looking young men down at DeGraff. They're always friendly when I see them in the hallway. I've heard them referred to as administrators. She said, have you ever thought of hospital administration? And I said, no, what's that? I had no idea what hospital administration was. And she said, well, why don't you go down to the hospital and talk to one of them? So I did, and he was a nice guy, and at the end of that conversation, he said, well, I did my master's at George Washington University, why don't you, and then come back and work for me? And it sort of sounded like a job offer, and I had nothing else in the world going on. So I applied to one school, George Washington. I not only needed to get admitted, even though I'd never taken a business class in my life, I needed to get something close to a full scholarship to go. And both of those things happened. So for random reasons, I end up at George Washington University studying to be a hospital administrator. And of all the hospitals in the country where I could have wound up to do my one-year residency, I had friends who went to San Diego, San Francisco, Boston. I got assigned to Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus, which was then the largest private general hospital in Ohio. And I sort of fumbled my way through a few years of trying to be an administrator, I was sort of a classic Peter Principle guy. I kept getting promoted because I got along well with people. I had reasonably good communication skills, but I was never going to be a crack administrator. I knew that. But I kept getting promoted, and so I stayed there for a few years, and then I'm home in North Tonawanda, Christmas break of 1983 at my parents' house, and I get a phone call from the director of public relations at the hospital in Columbus, and she said, Jeff, I have horrible news. And I thought I knew what it was. I thought it was one of the psychiatric patients in the hospital. There had been some sort of tragic incident. And she said, Patty Maddox and Joyce McFadden were murdered in the hospital the other day. And this was in a small research lab that I had administrative responsibility for. There were 6 people in the lab all together, a single door that led in and out of the lab, right off the main hallway of the hospital. And she said they were murdered between 4:30 and 5 in the afternoon. Nobody saw anything. The police don't have a clue who could have committed these murders. And they were very bloody, savage murders. They weren't like a silencer with a shot to the head. So, literally nothing could have surprised me anymore than that news. And I thought, what is going on here? A decade before, I'm immersed in the Manson case, and I felt like I've left that behind for a new career. And all of a sudden, these 2 women, who I knew, I had seen them right before I came home for Christmas break, were murdered in the hospital. And so going to the hospital was very difficult after that for me. I thought I was interacting every day with the person who committed the murders. I was wrong, but I thought I was. And I just thought, this attempt to be a hospital administrator was interesting, but it's not for me. So I'm going to go back and do my PhD in psychology and become a forensic psychologist and try to learn more about the kind of person who might have killed Joyce and Patty. So that's kind of the chronology of getting me to my career in forensic psychology. But I want to go back now and pick up, and by the way, in situations like this where I feel like I want to try and win over the audience early, what I usually do is begin by saying, I could talk all night, and then promising not to do it. So I promise I won't do it. Like, I'm more interested in your questions than my prattling on, but I do want to talk a little bit about my interactions with a couple notorious killers who most of you will have heard about. You know, one of the things, when Squeaky Fromme attempted to assassinate President Ford on September 5th, 1975, the FBI out in Sacramento found a cache of my letters in her apartment, which created an awkward situation for my father, who was still in the FBI. And I remember I was already at Purdue beginning work on my master's, and my dad called me and said, Jeff, my boss called me in today, and he said, Jack, I don't know how to tell you this, but the FBI in Sacramento found a bunch of letters in Squeaky Fromme's apartment from someone named Jeff, who has your last name and has been using your address in Wurlitzer Park. And so my dad knew about this. He thought I was nuts, but he never told me I had to stop. So he had to explain the actions of his wayward son to his boss. But that was one interesting chapter. And I refer to the weird summer of 1975, where I was a substitute mail carrier here in North Tonawanda that summer. And these letters were coming to me from Manson and Squeaky Fromme, and I would intercept them in the morning at the post office and hold them until the end of the day when I would take them home. And while my poor mother was just trying to prepare dinner, I would recite the contents of these crazed missives in the kitchen. And it was very interesting. It began with all love and peace and smiley faces and flowers. And in Squeaky Fromme's first letter to me, which was, I think, in March of '75, and I'm 21 at the time, and she says, Jeff, Charlie didn't do it. He is it. He's the only one who understands how to bring world peace about. And I'm like, what? And she had, you know, her loopy handwriting. I've often likened to kind of a middle school girl's loopy handwriting with all kinds of smiley faces and so on. And then within a period of 2 months, her roommate and fellow Manson devotee, Sandy Good, was ordering me to call up corporation heads who she believed were involved in polluting the environment, and saying things like, if you can't get these people to listen to you, tell them a wave of assassins will sweep through their homes and splash blood from room to room. And if they say, what? Tell them, Charles Manson, remember Sharon Tate? At one point they said, and some of you who are here in the audience might have been part of my fantasy of putting this plan that she suggested into real operation. She said, if you've got any close friends who aren't just mommy's boys, you could go to them and enlist their help and tell them to go out in the woods and kill a hunter, and then leave a sign on the tree saying, there are hunters hunting hunters. And she also suggested that I threaten some of these corporation executives with getting their arms chopped off. And this was in late June, 2 months before the assassination attempt. And at that point I thought, okay, I'm in over my head here. I need an exit strategy. And I found one and managed to extricate myself from that correspondence. But in a very short period of time, it went from this hippie talk to this very violent, apocalyptic talk. So that was an interesting feature of writing to the Manson women. Manson himself, I won't go into any detail about his letters. Sometimes they were semi-rational. A lot of times they sounded like pure lunacy, the kind you would expect Charles Manson to write, maybe. And I remember on one occasion he got furious with me over something I never thought would make him furious, but it sort of freaked me out. And he responded in a threatening way. And one of the things that was unsettling, to say the least, during that period of time is that I knew that he had a network of followers outside prison. Nobody knew how many or exactly where they were located, but one of the Manson killers, Susan Atkins, when she was in jail in Los Angeles awaiting trial, told another inmate, "We have lots of friends outside prison, and there are going to be many more murders." So I'm having these intrusive thoughts of these women showing up on my parents' doorstep, and it was an unsettling summer, to put it mildly. About a year after the hospital murders, I've decided to go to graduate school and start working on my PhD. And I thought, okay, I've had this experience with the Manson family members. I was reasonably successful, if you define success as getting them to write me back. And I thought, I know someone who might have information that would help me with my thinking about the kind of person who might have committed these hospital murders and then disappeared into thin air afterward, not seen by anyone. And that person was Ted Bundy, who then was on death row in Florida. And the chapter of my involvement with Ted Bundy is brief, but it's worth noting because I think it's classic. I wrote Bundy a letter, this was in 1984, and it was a long handwritten letter. He would have known from my letter that I had read a lot about his case, that I knew a fair amount about it. And I told him I'd like to have a dialogue with him. And my thinking was, if I could get him to communicate with me, maybe eventually we'd get to the point where I could actually talk with him about the hospital murders, and maybe he would have interesting things to say. At the end of my letter to him, I said, if you don't write me back, you'll never hear from me again. I'm not trying to bother you, but I'd like to have a dialogue with you. Well, he didn't write back. And I thought, well, okay, that's that. I didn't write him back either. A little more than a year later, I get 2 envelopes from Ted Bundy in my mailbox. One contains a Christmas card wishing me and mine all blessings and all best in the upcoming year. And the second was a brief letter, and this is what I think is classic. You know, this guy's sitting on death row for killing and sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl, as well as going on a rampage in the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. You know, his prospects are pretty grim. And he says, you know, as for the questions you asked me in your letter, all I can say is I found them very searching and thoughtful. I've never felt better in my life, spiritually, mentally, and physically. The same, I hope the same can be said for you. And then this man whose reputation was built in large part on his unbelievable mobility, the distances he would travel in search of victims, killed women in Utah, Colorado, Oregon, Washington State, finally in Florida. In FBI parlance, he was a rover. And so he ends his letter after telling me how great he feels. Take care, watch yourself, travel light. Peace, Ted. And I didn't have the experience at the time to realize it, but over time I came to understand that, I mean, that's the classic serial killer's tease, the game that they love to play. And I imagine when Bundy wrote that, he was thinking, this is going to be cute. In 3 short phrases, I can provide both a recipe for how to succeed if you're someone like me. Always be watchful, know your surroundings, be ready to move at a moment's notice. Or it could be read as a recipe for how to avoid falling prey to someone like me. And I think he enjoyed it and knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote those words. So that was the brief Bundy chapter. About a year into my graduate studies, I decided that it was time to try and engage another notorious serial killer. So I wrote John Wayne Gacy, who was on death row in Illinois. And that turned into a 3-year correspondence. I went to visit Gacy twice on two different occasions, 2 days each time, and spent about 20 hours with him. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Gacy case, he was convicted in, I guess his trial was in 1980. He was arrested in December of '78, but he was found guilty of killing 33 boys and young men, which at the time was the most of anyone in American history. And there are a lot of things that stand out from my interactions with Gacy, and I talk about quite a few of them in the book. But one, I've got a visual aid here that I'm going to produce in a minute. He painted a lot in prison, and he wasn't like an original painter, but he was a pretty good copier, and he would copy other people's paintings and pictures. And sometimes he would bring a painting out and prop it against the wall while we were talking. And he would say things like, you know, Jeff, don't think I'm trying to pressure you to buy a painting, but this is how I pay for envelopes. It's how I pay for envelopes and stamps. And I did end up with 3 Gacy paintings. I'm going to show you 2 of them. This is one that he custom did with me in mind. It's a knockoff of Picasso's famous Don Quixote drawing, but you'll notice my initials on the shield. And one of the most prolific liars of the 20th century declared that I was a quester after the truth. So I'm not sure what that means, but that's his Don Quixote. But getting back to the story I was just telling you, on this particular day, this was the painting that he had propped up on the wall, the table, the dwarfs from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And we weren't talking about the painting at all. It was just propped up there. And we were talking about the crimes that he was convicted of. And I had learned by that time I had to be kind of gentle when I challenged him, because he was a very prickly narcissist. You know, he didn't like being challenged, and I knew that by then. But I was asking him about these crimes, and he said, Jeff, come on, man. You're smarter than this. You know that I couldn't have been responsible for all those bodies they found under my house. And I said, well, you know, I mean, I know there was a trial, and there was a lot of testimony and evidence presented. I know you were found guilty of 33 murders, 26 bodies under your house, 4 elsewhere on your property, and 4 that were thrown in the Des Plaines River. And he said, now, that wasn't a house like you think of a house. It was like a business place. People came and went. Lots of people had keys to that house. Other people could have been involved. And at this point he says, he told me that he knew something about 5 of them. And he eventually told me a little bit. You know, he would say things like, yeah, you know, we had sex, we did a little bit of drinking, but that's really all I can tell you, because my attorneys say I can't say anything more. And I said, but didn't they find him under your house? And he said, I can't get into that. But on this particular, we're talking about the victims of his crimes. And he holds his hands like you're holding a deck of cards, you know, like you would fan out the cards. And he says, you know what, Jeff? I got pictures of every one of those kids that they say I killed back in my cell. And I look at those pictures, and those kids are no more real to me than, and he sort of paused like he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. And then he says, than those cartoon characters in that painting. And I remember thinking, that is probably the first true thing he said all day, that they really were no more real to him as flesh and blood human beings than those cartoon characters. So, with that, I'm going to stop. I could go on, believe me. But I'm going to stop and ask for questions, so I have a chance to maybe respond to some of the things that you're interested in.
The hospital murders, who did it?
The hospital murders, who did it? I didn't plant her in the audience. But it's a question I was hoping somebody would ask me. It's a fascinating story. And Denny Grinnell and I were talking about it. Denny was involved in doing some training later on based on this case. But they didn't arrest anyone. Those of us at the hospital had no idea who had committed these murders. And about 2.5 years after the murders, I picked the newspaper up one morning from my doorstep, and the headline was "Worst Shootout in FBI History Outside Miami. 2 agents killed, 5 agents wounded, 2 suspects killed in this shootout." And I was interested right away because my dad was an FBI agent and so on. So I started reading down it, and it says, one of the suspects killed in the shootout with the authorities was William Maddox, formerly of Columbus, Ohio, whose wife was murdered under mysterious circumstances on December 30th, 1983. And there are a lot of things that make this incredible. But Maddox and his wife had a 4-month-old infant at the time of her murder. And everyone knew Maddox as this very quiet Baptist. Patty, his wife, was that way, very quiet. And apparently, after the murders, Maddox met an old Army buddy of his, went down to Florida, and they got involved in all kinds of nefarious criminal activity down there before this shootout. But about probably 8 years ago, I had lunch with the detective who was the head homicide detective in Columbus on the Riverside murders, the hospital murders. And he went down to Florida to search the suspects' apartments, hoping to find a smoking gun that would definitively tie them to the hospital murders, and they didn't find one. But the assumption is that one or both of them did it. It was a very bizarre case. Yeah, Chris. Yeah, why?
Chris Daylor?
Yes, I know who you are. Good to see you, Chris.
I want to get a sense of, are you for or against the death penalty?
I'm against the death penalty. I always have been. And whether that hurt me or not in my career of appearing as an expert in death penalty cases, I don't know. I would always encourage the attorneys who hired me. I was always hired by the defense. They were the ones who had the client needing to be evaluated. And I would always tell the attorneys, when you're qualifying me as an expert witness, please ask me about my personal view about the death penalty so I can get it out there under positive questioning as opposed to hostile questioning from the other side. So I always owned that in court. And what would sometimes happen is that the prosecution would say, even that case in Cincinnati you worked on, Pee Wee Garner, where he gave a 6-year-old girl a glass of water in the middle of the night, and then knowing that there were 4 other children sleeping, set the house on fire and killed all the children. Even in that case, you don't support the death penalty? And I would say, no, I'm just generally opposed to it. And at that point, the judge would say, okay, that's enough of that questioning. We're not going to allow you to just get into all of the details of the worst crimes ever. But I'm opposed to it. I understand the arguments on the other side, but that's my position. Yeah.
How much did you pay John Wayne Gacy for those paintings?
I didn't plant that questioner either. But it's a,
I do have another series.
well, I mean, that's a great question. One of them he gave me for free. The other 2 I paid $30 for. And when I got involved on Facebook a few years ago, I put that off for as long as I could. And then I was having trouble contacting someone who I needed to contact. And I decided Facebook was the way to do it. And all my family members said, don't do it, Dad. Don't do it, Jeff. It'll be like a black hole. You'll never emerge from Facebook. But I did do it. And one of the things I did was, there are these murderabilia groups on Facebook, of this culture, these people who collect the artifacts of killers, and I thought, well, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in who those people are, how they communicate with each other, and so on. So I joined a couple of those groups, and I decided after long, I'm going to test the market. Not because I was going to sell these paintings, but I was interested in what people would pay for them. And I put pictures of the 3 paintings, and that day, I could have got made between $7,000 and $8,000. And I paid a total of $60 for the 3. So you said you had a serious question. That is a serious question.
I was just curious as to all the people that you've interviewed, who disturbed you the most? I mean, you have to be really afraid of someone. I just wondered which one of them really, really got you.
The question was, of all these violent criminals I interviewed, and there were hundreds, and 300 death penalty cases. Most of those people you've never heard of, but I think to do the kind of work I did, you become pretty good at compartmentalization, or you couldn't do it. And I did get pretty good at that, I think. But right toward the end of my career, there's a case that, and I worked on cases of people who abducted young children from their beds and sexually abused and killed them. So, horrible, horrible facts. But this one case, it was from Canton, Ohio. This man had been involved in a very nasty divorce, and he had his visitation time with his 2 children. And it was at night, and they were in their car seats in the back of his car. And he spent all night talking to his wife saying, "We need to talk." And she said, "No, we don't need to talk, James. We're done talking. You enjoy your time with the children." And this went on and on, multiple phone calls, and he finally said, "You don't understand. We need to talk." And she said, "No," and hung up. And he killed both his children in their car seats, and then went and killed his former mother-in-law, too. But that was very disturbing to me, just for obvious reasons. Yeah.
Do you attribute people that commit these horrific acts, do you attribute it more to nature, nurture, or a combination?
A combination. I think that there are certain people who are hardwired in a way that makes them vulnerable to traveling a certain antisocial path, and if someone or some people intervene along the way, they can be salvaged most of the time. It's a minority view, but there are some people, a well-known psychiatrist who wrote a book about her experience dealing with violent criminals, said at the end of the book that she thinks that there'll be a time when serial killers can be identified in the womb. I'm certainly nowhere close to believing that that's true, but there are some people who do believe that's true. But I think in most cases it's a combination. In the backgrounds of almost all these people, you find, severe trauma and dysfunction. And the obvious response to that was, well, you find that in a lot of people's lives, but they still find a way to live pro-social, lives. So it doesn't automatically make someone an antisocial personality or a criminal, but some combination of factors, I would say.
So somebody who, let's say, had this predisposition, from basically it was genetic, if they had, let's say they had a good upbringing now, loving family and intact family, can that offset some of that biological? Do you think it can offset some of those biological triggers?
Basically, I don't know that I would say offset, and not in the sense that it cancels or nullifies that, but experiences with very positive caregivers and teachers and so on along the way might temper the effects of that hard wiring so that they don't become as horrible as the hard wiring acting by itself might cause them to become. Coach Gay.
Of all the cases that you had, that you testified for, how many of those were started out as this domestic?
The question was of all the cases, and you mean like death penalty cases, how many of those began as domestic disputes? I would say a relatively small number. Well, yeah, like that one I just mentioned obviously did, and I can think of some others, but of the 300, you know, back in the 90s, when at least in Ohio, it was sort of the heyday of the death penalty, there were a lot of cases charged as death penalty cases. And back then, by far the most common ones were the ones called felony murder, where someone's robbing a convenience store, and in the course of the robbery, they kill someone. And it becomes an aggravated murder, death penalty eligible crime. That would have been the most common one back then. But, yes?
To what specifically, if anything, did you attribute Manson's hold over his followers? And the second part of the question is, did you or anyone else ever check, like, the IQs, for example, of Frommie and those people?
Yeah, what did I attribute Manson's hold over his followers to, and did I test the IQ of, or did anybody of some of these people? To the first question, I mean, I think it's complicated. Manson was a career criminal. Horrible dysfunctional background, shuttled from foster home to reform school and back. Terrible childhood. And, I don't think he ever dreamed of becoming a big-time criminal. In fact, he told them in 1967 when they were going to let him out, I can't function out there. Don't send me out there. But they did. And what he walked into was the summer of love in San Francisco, where all of these people looking for guidance and a mentor. And all of a sudden, Manson realized these skills that I've worked on developing for years, these persuasive skills, I can bring to bear on this situation. And I think he couldn't at first believe his luck when he got these first couple women to fall behind him. And then it just kind of mushroomed from there. And he was really good at it. And he would do things like one of the things he would do, and he did this in letters to me, was play with people's names. He saw that as a way to kind of uproot them from their family moorings. He would give them a new name. He used to address me as Smalldon Bigdon sometimes, and play with my name in the same way he did with his followers. That was one of the things he did. And he used lots of other ways of, I remember in one letter he said to me, Jeff, you're my kid, my son, my love, my child, and my reflection. Step from your past and be free. So it was this kind of exaggerated hippie talk of kind of just leaving everything that you had thought before was responsible for your identity and your settledness in society. Leave that behind. So he had all kinds of different ways that he used to do that. As for the IQs of these killers, some of them, like one case I haven't talked about, but I devoted an entire chapter in my book to, that I worked on. It's a very notorious Ohio case of a serial murderer who was also a sniper. Like, he didn't know any of his victims. He killed them with a high-powered rifle from 300 feet off the road, no interaction with them at all. And he was a really smart guy. He was a graduate of Ohio State's journalism school, unusually bright, like 145 IQ, very, very superior. Bundy has probably been supposed to be brighter than he is. The Bundy legend is that he was this brilliant master criminal. And there were some things he was very good at that enabled him to avoid detection for a long time, but I don't think he was as smart as this sniper I'm talking about, Thomas Lee Dillon. Manson, very, very street savvy. And I don't know that anyone ever gave Manson an IQ or if he would ever cooperate with one. He probably would do poorly on it, but had a different kind of intelligence. I don't think he would score. John Wayne Gacy, probably 115, 120, above average, but not genius or anything like that. Yeah, Mike?
Regarding your picture, the John Wayne Gacy picture with the
Dwarfs.
Dwarfs. Have you found, because he said that they meant nothing to him any more than cartoon characters, with all of the recent killings, have you found any association between some of the computer games that the kids are playing and a lot of these shootings that are occurring? Has there been any correlation between that you found?
Not that I've found, and my understanding is that the research on that question, I think there's a lot of research being done about that, to date really hasn't shown a very robust relationship between computer games. But just at a common sense level, I think it's easy to conclude that there's some level of detachment that develops over time. And in certain kinds of people could manifest in that, dehumanization of victims. Just one more example of the same thing, the example of dehumanizing victims like Gacy did. That serial sniper who I was just talking about, after he pled guilty to 5 counts of aggravated murder, he agreed to participate in an interview with a newscaster from Ohio. And I remember at one point during the interview, and Thomas Lee Dillon, this killer, as I said, is a very bright guy. And she says, well, do you think about these people who you killed? Like when you lie in bed at night, do you think about these victims? And Dillon looked at her like the question was coming from outer space or something. He kind of like winced a little and he said, no. I just think of them as a group, not as individuals. And I just said, I thought at the time, there it is again, that just inability to connect, that radical absence of empathy. Yeah,
Question around, what are your thoughts on parole? Is there a rehabilitation? Okay, if you're not going to execute them, then leave them in jail until they die?
Yeah, in the latter part of my career, the law in Ohio changed to allow for life without the possibility of parole. And once that was on the books, very few juries chose death. They were much more prepared for that without the possibility of parole. For the people who commit these very serious violent crimes, I'm skeptical of parole. Like, you probably all saw on the news a couple years ago, the one Manson follower, the woman who was involved in some of the murders, Leslie Van Houten, who had appeared again and again and again and again before the parole board and gotten denied every time, even though she had many supporters who said she's fully rehabilitated, there's no way she would ever commit a violent offense again. And the governor of Ohio, including Gavin Newsom, and including Jerry Brown, wouldn't accept the parole board's recommendation that she be paroled. It was just too politically explosive. But finally, she was released about 2 or 3 years ago. My understanding, she's living in a halfway house now. But, a long time after 1969 murders. And she was described as a model inmate, like she wasn't that person. But, yes?
That would be in regards to how come we don't hear that much about serial killers as we did back then? Is it because the forensics is better and we can capture them more or quicker, I guess?
It's a good question. Why don't we hear more about serial murder? Back in the 70s, there was Bundy and Gacy, and there was a whole spate of them. And there don't seem to be as many now. And I think that the progress in policing has a good deal to do with that. They know that it's going to be much harder to escape detection with DNA testing and genetic profiling. That's what was used to finally arrest the guy in this befuddling murder of the 4 students in Idaho. That trial's coming up in June, and I'm hoping there'll be some light shed on that bizarre, mysterious case. But some of those advances in policing, my guess, are dampening down the number of those cases. But I had somebody else ask me the other day, is there a possibility that it could go the other way? That now that the internet is available, that it provides new ways for these predators to access victims, and I think that's true too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Susan Gosh.
Hi, Sue. Gosh, I haven't seen you in so long.
50 or so years.
Nice to see you again.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
So I'm in the book, I'm reading it, and there's a particular statement that John Wayne Gacy wrote to you, and it kind of envelops some of the comments that you made earlier. And Gacy says to you, "You're gonna find out I'm a normal person, just like you." So that's kind of is that the kind of cover that they operate under? That they think that they're just like us or you or anyone else, and what they're doing isn't really that different or that bad or that?
Well, yes, I'd say yes and no. So, like Manson used to say, so kind of like, what's the big deal? Kissinger and all these people are involved in the Vietnam War. You know, they're killing all these people. Where's the outrage over those deaths? What about My Lai? So they're quick to sort of point to other examples of people doing horrible things, or like people ignoring regulations that they know could save lives in factories and so on, health and safety regulations, like wanting to skirt those and those are resulting in deaths. Why aren't people outraged by that? Why all this focus on me? But I also think, I chose as the title of my book, That Beast Was Not Me, which was a quote from the first proper letter Charles Manson ever wrote me. And like many of these killers, he was resisting attempts by other people to define who he is and explain his behavior. He said, "Jeff, our side of the family was never told. That beast was not me, but it's what everyone in society needs me to be, so they make me up to be a reflection of their fears, lies, and bullshit." That was the exact quote. And so to me, that beast was not me stood both for the killer's resistance to our attempts to understand them, and it also stood for the difficult challenge every time you try to clearly delineate the lines that separate them from everybody else. Yeah, David.
I was thinking, if the killers did what they did, they got away with it, why would they kill the person and then go back for another person if they know they can get what they want from them without killing them?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Why do they keep on killing? Like if you go out and assault somebody and you come back the next day, you don't get caught, you go out and assault somebody again, you're getting away with it. But then maybe you put some fear into them to try to bring somebody else to you so that you can assault them and get away with it.
Well, I think with the serial killers, as I said earlier, a lot of it is the attraction for them of the game, the thrill of hiding in plain sight. And they've got a fantasy of how this is going to play out, how their murder is going to take place. And of course, the reality never meets the fantasy. So there's a continuing effort to get closer and closer to fulfillment of a fantasy that will never be fulfilled. And you know, they get a taste for it. They like it, and they love the game with the authorities. Like I said, hiding in plain sight. The biggest thrill comes when, like Thomas Dillon, the serial sniper, you know, he was so well camouflaged. He looked like kind of this milquetoast, middle-class guy, married to his wife, his very nice woman. She's a nurse at the local hospital. She's in the choir at church. They've got a 10-year-old son. Tom's got friends he plays tennis with, and so on. He's very well camouflaged while he's committing these murders. His killing years were 1989 to 1992. But it was a big thrill for him to be able to hide in plain sight for that long and get away with it.
And hence, like the statement that I read, you find that I'm just like you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Gacy really thought he was just like me, but.
No, I don't mean
don't forget, though. behind the mask. But I think when Gacy said, "You're going to find out I'm a normal person just like you," he actually, the very first time I met Gacy in person, he signed in by protesting against the media image. He said, "I know, you're here expecting to meet the monster. Well, now it's time to meet the man." You know, how grandiose is that? Now you're going to meet the man, and you're going to find I'm nothing like what you've read about. And he says, "I don't give any interviews. I don't talk with Oprah Winfrey wants to talk with me. Phil Donahue wants to talk with me. Fuck them. I don't have to correct their errors. They've dug their hole. Let them stay in it. You're going to meet the man." So it's this. I'm going to prove those people wrong, that I'm not the person they've said I am. But I don't really think deep down he believed that he's quite like me. Yeah.
Do you think narcissism is a common trait of all these?
Extremely so.
Yeah.
Probably the most common trait, along with antisocial. But yeah, they're so self-centered. When I would talk with Gacy, after a while, the conversation would become so dreary because he was sort of drawing from this deep, deep well of aggrievement and persecution and drone on and on and on. And I remember thinking, is he ever going to stop? And occasionally he would catch himself and he would say, "How are your classes going?" and I would say, "Oh, they're not bad." And I would tell him what courses I was taking. And then, very quickly, he's back into John Wayne Gacy. So narcissism's a huge part of it. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, do you have any advice for a younger person like me wanting to go into this? And then my second one is, do you notice psychosis as a common factor between killers?
First question first. One of the things, well, a couple of things. I mean, you have to be very curious about people. Curious enough that you're willing to sit with people who are dedicated to the challenge of deceiving and manipulating you. And that's not easy to do. I mean, that takes a lot of patience and fortitude to hang in there with some of these people. I frankly was better at it during the first part of my career than I was in the latter years when I think I was growing kind of jaded. But the curiosity and the perseverance is very important. Two other important things, one of which is maybe obvious, not that I necessarily demonstrate it, but I think it's important, and that's communication skills, because you're going to end up in court, you're going to need to talk with juries in a way that is plain spoken and persuasive. Not that you're arguing for a particular outcome, but your credibility is at stake. So you need to be an effective communicator. And you also need to be a writer. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about. Not so much in death penalty cases, but in child custody cases. I wrote an enormous amount, in the last years of my career, between 4,000 and 5,000 single-space typewritten pages of court-ready reports a year. It's a lot. So you need to like to write and be willing to put in the time to do it. And that's something a lot of people don't think about, I mean, it's not the sexy part of being a forensic psychologist, but it's an important part. I'm sorry, what was the second one?
Do you notice psychosis as a common factor between killers?
The question was, is psychosis a common factor in these cases? I would say no. It's a very rare factor, in fact. I can't think offhand of a death penalty defendant who I believed was psychotic at the time of the murders. Seriously personality disordered, maybe bipolar or manic depressive. But, well, I can think of a couple that I believe were delusional, which is a form of psychosis. But people think of schizophrenia or something. I can't think of a schizophrenic death penalty defendant that I worked with offhand anyway. much more common are the severely personality disordered, antisocial, narcissistic, and so on. Coach.
A few years ago, we had the bike path killer, and I was wondering, did you ever look into his situation? Or?
I read the book about it, but I can't remember much at all, to be honest.
Because there was a period of like 10 years where he stopped, and no one has ever found out why.
Yeah, that's really unusual. It's not unprecedented, but it's unusual. You know,
the best argument against the death penalty.
I'm sorry?
The best argument against the death penalty because the wrong person was in jail, right? Wasn't that?
I think that's right. Didn't they got the wrong person initially?
So,
What was that guy named Sanchez or something?
yeah.
Yeah, and I don't.
He had a couple of kids. And
Yeah.
He was a different shift than his wife.
They had a sort of mentally disabled man and been convicted and was in prison.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
To your argument against the death penalty.
No, that's a good point. But I wish I remembered more about that case, Coach. I read. My memory's not what it used to be.
I mean, you talked about personalities and being able to live 2 different lives, or maybe 3 or 4 different lives. Well, this fellow's different. His wife and children had
No idea. Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre, but exciting for those guys to be able to pull that off, that compartmentalization, for the killers.
Yeah. One other
Yeah,
question.
sure.
You mentioned that you were against the death penalty. As a prosecutor, wouldn't they use that, your testimony against you, against your case? Say, look, this guy is against the death penalty, so he's going to make all kinds of excuses for his client?
Yeah. I mean,
they ever excused from a case because?
No, I mean, I tried to neutralize that. Not that it was my job to refute those claims or push back against them, but I always knew that they were coming. So that's why I would have the attorneys who hired me ask me under friendly questioning to own my view. But certainly prosecutors would try to convince the jury to discount my testimony because I didn't believe in the death penalty. And the place where they did that most vigorously was when I was no longer in the courtroom during their closing arguments. They would say, you heard from defense expert Dr. Smalldon, but why believe what he says? He doesn't even believe in the death penalty. And then it comes down to whether the jury found me persuasive, reliable witness, or if they just saw me as an advocate, as someone who was, trying to save this guy from the death penalty. And I always worked very hard to avoid giving that impression. This is the last thing I'll say about my view on the death penalty, but I always felt like it was never my role to argue against the death penalty or to make the case for the defense. That was for the attorneys to do. I was there to tell the jury what I had found out about this defendant. And I always said, if I have a bias, it's the belief that if I worked hard enough, if I dug deep enough, I would find the material in this person's life that, if presented to the jury, at least would make a significant case for allowing this person to continue living. Any other? Yes?
What makes a person a narcissist? Does it start off when they're young, the way the parents raised them?
Yeah, the question was what makes a person a narcissist, and I don't have a easy answer to that, but I think narcissists tend to travel one of 2 pathways. Either they're overvalued as children, taught that they're entitled, that they're different, they're special from other kids, or they're cut down in a way that they have such low self-esteem that they develop what's called compensatory narcissism, where their narcissism is such a thin veneer over this deep well of self-doubt and low self-esteem. So, those are the 2 pathways that most commonly result in narcissism. Yeah?
I'm not sure of your experience, but what would be the major difference between serial killers and a mass killer, some, you know, someone who goes to school and shoots, you know, 19 children.
Yeah. The question was, what is the general difference between serial killers and mass killers? And I would say, you know, in a general sense, mass killers are more emotionally reactive. And they typically have in mind either retribution for some perceived wrong, or it's an extreme emotional response. You know, they're under tremendous stress and they explode in rage that results in multiple victims. Serial killers, on the other hand, are typically very organized, calculating. They know what they're doing. There's cooling off periods between murders. They're not emotionally reactive like that. Most commonly, they're very calculating, deliberate, and organized.
Even the mass killers who, you know, plan and, you know, get done with a lot of serious planning before they execute the mass shooting.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking of like somebody like Timothy McVeigh or somebody like that, just as an example.
Or, you know,
Yeah, I mean, I hate to generalize, but most of them have a grievance of some kind, and it may be that, you know, this group of school children, it really has nothing to do with the core reason for their sense of aggrievement, but it comes to symbolize what they oppose, whether it be the educational system in general, or, but yeah, I mean, they may not be emotionally reacting to those victims. Anything? Yeah.
You said in the beginning about getting the letters at home. At any one point, were you afraid of getting too personal or giving out too much personal information to any one of your serial killers? Did you hold anything back? Like,
yeah, yes. Yes and yes. I mean, I'll tell you the thing that infuriated Manson, and he surprised me. This was the summer of 1975. Manson kept saying, I don't believe you're a man, because men don't write that neatly. He said, I think you're a woman writing under a man's name. That was a consistent theme. And he would also say things like, I can't communicate my thoughts to you in writing. You know, I have a 4th grade education or something. I can't write very well. And he started saying, stop writing to me. Send me pictures. And Sandy and Squeaky also had wanted a picture, but they were very specific. They said, we would like a picture of you. We'd like to see what you look like. And I sent them a picture, but it was one that didn't look like me at all. Because I was afraid these women might show up on my doorstep, which incidentally was also Jeff Human's doorstep. Our senior year at Valparaiso, Jeff lived in the front of this house. I lived in the back, and that's where these letters were coming. So Jeff, you were vulnerable as well. No, I didn't send him. That's what I should have done. So I should have we had the same name. I should have just said it's Jeff. You know, here's my picture. But I did send them a picture that didn't look like me. But Manson never said, send me a picture of you. What he said is, send me pictures for my photo album. Okay, that left some room for interpretation. And so he was angry at me anyway during that period. And at the end of one of his letters, he said, I told you, now do it. Send me pictures. Don't write me, send me pictures. So I took a while and thought, okay, well, what kind of picture might somebody like Charles Manson enjoy receiving? And let me just take a sip. One of Manson's themes was society is evil. Sorry. We need to leave society behind and our parents behind and so on. And so I was reading an article one day in the National Geographic about the search for the world's oldest person. And there was a picture of a shepherd somewhere in South America sitting on a stool, playing a wooden flute, dog peacefully lying at his side. I thought, that's got Charles Manson written all over it. He'll love this, evocation of the pastoral life. So I sent him that picture. I didn't even attach a Post-it note saying, I hope you like this, Charlie, or anything. I just sent it in an envelope without a note or anything. Right after that, I got the only airmail letter I've ever received from prison. Whether that was the only stamp Manson had available that day, or he was just bound and determined to get this response to me as quickly as he could. This is one I did not read my mother, because he made all sorts of obscene comments about my mother in this letter, as well as about me. He railed against me. Just said, I'd never realized you were such a fake and phony, and on and on and on, and worked himself into a lather. By the end of the letter, he was sort of slashing across the page and was obviously in a rage. And I thought, well, that wasn't the response I expected to that pastoral picture. But I thought, I'm not going to write him anymore because that letter kind of freaked me out. And then 2 days later, I got another letter from him, not prompted by a letter from me because I didn't respond to that hate letter. And it was unusual. He sort of apologized and said, if I reflected wrong on you or at you, it's your job to understand that life's been difficult for me. I'm not an easy person to get along with. I understand. But it was the closest to a sort of reflective apology that I ever heard from Manson. And so we continued our correspondence. But yeah, I was afraid of the people outside prison much more than someone like Manson or Gacy or Bundy. Yes?
What kind of interview process did you have to do to be able to write to these people?
You mean how did I get permission, or when I was with them, how did I talk to them?
Yes. No, how did you get permission to even do that? I mean, I understand because of your occupation, I understand that part, but like, what kind of process did you have to go through?
Well, I wasn't yet a forensic psychologist when the Manson, Bundy, and Gacy contacts took place, but the proper way to do that, which I didn't really understand at the time, was to work through their attorney. If they still had legal representation, to work through their attorney. There's one chapter in my book devoted to the prison interview I did with medical serial killer Donald Harvey, who back in the late 80s pled guilty to 37 murders and claimed that he had killed 87 people. And by that time, I did know the importance of working through his attorney. And it turned out he was still represented by the attorney who negotiated the plea deal that probably saved him from the death penalty. And not only did the attorney work to enable my interview with his client, he was there at the prison. Said, do you mind if I'm there? And I said, no, not at all. And he said, I won't say anything, I'll just sit in the corner, but I'd like to be there. And I said, no, that's fine. So that's the right way to do it. Yeah.
It occurs to me that every single person we've talked about except for Squeaky is a man. And I wondered if you've dealt with any, maybe under death penalty cases, were there women involved in any of those, or is this primarily a...
Definitely primarily men. Not many women. I think I had 2 death penalty cases involving women. One pled out before trial, one went to trial, and it was a mass murder, 4 victims. And it was all OxyContin related in southern Ohio, and she killed 4 people. But that was highly unusual. She didn't get the death penalty, by the way, but mostly men. Yeah.
Let's go back to those letters. So when you were doing the writing with Squeaky Frommie and Manson and that whole crew, that was before your forensics work, correct?
More than a decade before.
What stopped your father from saying, what the hell are you doing?
Maybe I should ask my sister. She might have a better idea of that.
That is
Yeah, my parents were incredibly tolerant. They were conservative, another understatement. They were conservative, by the book, by the law people. But I wasn't being secret about this. They knew what I was doing. They knew, and maybe this is what provided me a little cover in their eyes. They knew that I was acting on the suggestion of one of my professors when I started this, and they knew it was an academic interest. They knew I wasn't going to flee to the West Coast and join the cult. But they were incredibly tolerant, looking back, to allow this. Kathy?
You've been interviewed a lot, you're talking about your book, and you're going around discussing it. Does that give you an opportunity to stand back from yourself and reflect, maybe not, I know you reflect on your career in the book, but about all of how this topic is so interesting to people, and maybe giving you an impetus for using that information and seeing what people are curious about for your next project?
I am very interested in why people are as interested as they are in true crime and particularly serial murder. I don't know that I understand it very well. I know that a number of explanations have been put forward to account for it, that people feel safer as they gather more information about how these people operate, and they think that maybe that they can keep themselves safe. And I think, people are just attracted, like me, to the sort of exotic, the unusual, the outside, the bounds of the usual. And, somebody asked me the other day, well, do you think you'll write another book? And I'm probably too old to do that. But I've been not only interested in murders, I've been interested in Appalachian snake handlers and sideshow performers and all kinds. I avoided the use of the word freak, but that's what I meant. But yeah, all of that, and I have stories that go with all of those interests, so that I'm sort of, I think of myself as kind of an amateur, often bumbling cultural anthropologist, checking out these weird pockets of American culture.
Did you talked about working with the defense attorneys for these murderers, or have you also worked with law enforcement to catch?
I haven't, though. I used to do screening for a police department, applicant screening. I've consulted with the Ohio Attorney General's office. I've certainly consulted with prosecutors' offices, never on a death penalty case. But I always, when defense attorneys were qualifying me as an expert, I always made sure that there was a question in there that gave me an opportunity to say, I'm the son of a career FBI agent. I've consulted with the state attorney general's office. I've done sanity and competency evaluations for prosecutors, because I wanted juries to know that. But no, I've never consulted with law enforcement, like in profiling or done that sort of thing.
I'm wondering if you would agree with an opinion. Often people have that eventually some of these serial killers, they slip up. Is it on purpose? Do they want to get caught? I can even hear that. Do you have any credibility to that?
I don't think they want to get caught, but they gamble more. They become more careless under the guise of seeking greater and greater risk.
Is that because they're more confident the more they get away with it?
Well, yeah, oftentimes I think that's part of it. They become, one of the things, at the back of my book there's a photo gallery, and I caused my wife and some friends in Evanston, Illinois, mild annoyance a couple of years ago by insisting that we track down a couple Gacy sites. And one of the sites I really wanted to see was this, where Gacy kidnapped his last victim. Because I think it's sort of the cardinal example of how brazen these people become at a certain point. This is like a tiny little strip mall that's maybe, it's not as long as from that wall to the back of these first bookcases. It's short. And there was a pharmacy there, and Gacy was there doing a reconstruction job in the pharmacy. And he saw a young man inside the pharmacy and said, I can pay you more than they're paying you here. And this young 15-year-old boy's mother was waiting for him in the parking lot in a car. And the mother was going in and out between the inside of the pharmacy and the parking lot. And if you get the book and you see the picture of the site where Nissan's pharmacy used to be, you'll see what I mean about how small the space is. She's going in and out between the pharmacy and her car. Her son, Rob, goes to her and says, Mom, I'll be right back. I'm going to talk to this man about a summer job. Never seen again. So, I mean, that's how brazen Gacy had become by that point. And, you know, I think for some of them, the more they ratchet up the tension and the risk, the more exciting it becomes for them. But they also, they're so narcissistic that they often can't admit that it was good police work that brought them down. Like Thomas Dillon, the serial sniper, would say to me, you know, he said, remember that case of Leopold and Loeb, who were those two brilliant kids outside Chicago in the 20s who tried to commit the perfect murder, but they left a pair of eyeglasses behind. That was their undoing. And Dillon would say, you know, I get that. I think I know what those guys were doing. It was like murder as a mind exercise, like a game, and I get that. And he said, I made a mistake like they did. I didn't leave eyeglasses, but I sold a Swedish Mauser at a gun show, and that was my undoing. But they get careless eventually. Yes?
Did you ever get into Dahmer? And if not,
I'm sorry, who?
Dahmer.
Jeffrey Dahmer.
Dahmer.
And if not, why?
No good reason, so I was never asked to professionally. I guess that his arrest was in the early 90s and obviously out of state, even though his roots were in Ohio. But no, I mean, I never got involved. I'm interested in it. I've read a lot about it, but I never had any involvement myself. Yes.
I'm curious. You mentioned Squeaky's name has come up several times, and you mentioned earlier how Manson was renaming people. Squeaky couldn't have been her given name.
No. Her given name was Lynette.
Lynette, okay.
But whether she made squeaky noises during sex or for some other reason, there have been a number of suggestions about how she came to be called Squeaky.
But he gave that to her.
He gave that to her, I believe. One more question, then I think we're going to need to wrap it up. How about someone who hasn't asked one yet?
How long did it take you to write the book?
I mean, this book has had a long gestational phase. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but I think the start of the pandemic is when I sort of really sat down and started devoting 4 or 5 hours a day to it. And I still, you know, I was serious about wanting to write it, but I didn't know if I could pull it off, in part because I had no idea how to do the sort of practical aspects of getting a book published, prepare a manuscript,